Time's up. The whistle blew. All activity in the room stopped. And I breathed a sigh of relief. For the torture and the humiliation were done. The annual infliction that was known as the President's Physical Fitness Test was complete. Whether it was the segment of sit-ups or pull-ups or push-ups, leg lifts, the run, or whether it was the dreaded rope climb that I never got off the ground with. It was all an occasion to be judged. And every year, I came up wanting. I not only knew that, but now my whole gym class knew that. In fact, I was sure the whole world knew that I was physically challenged. Thinking back, I wonder if that's when the bullying started. They knew what they were dealing with. I don't know. What I do know is that it was a day of great judgment, and I was always found wanting. I'd failed. There was proof. I couldn't do it. And yet, as devastating as that was, there was always a note of hope, because they would offer the test next year. And just maybe, somehow, I would improve my lot, and maybe even pass it. Well, that never happened. But I did live with that judgment and hope. Those are the themes of Advent, especially this first week in Advent, where we return to the apocalyptic sections of the Gospels, those sections that speak of the end times. It's not always been that final judgment sense that we conjure up these days. Because if we look at the apocalyptic themes and strings in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, we find that rather than pointing to an event in the future, they point backwards to an event that has happened, to that great and terrible day of the Lord, which for the Hebrew Scriptures was the day Jerusalem fell and the citizens were carried off to Babylon. It is a judgment upon the Hebrew people, but it is also a reminder to keep their act together, to practice the law, the Torah, because in so doing, they minimize the chances of that kind of an event happening. But at the same time, they also become the ways in which one lives one's life in the midst of those little apocalypses that happen in our lives. The New Testament, however, reframes apocalyptic to that end time. It's heavily influenced by Greek and Roman thought of the day, and so it becomes linear. The Christian writers in the 2nd and 3rd centuries go even so far as to reorder the Hebrew Scriptures to make that clear. Instead of ending with a reminder of the exile as the Hebrew Scriptures do, the Christian Scriptures point to the coming of the Messiah in the reordering, so that it becomes a nice move from old to new, ending with that final day of judgment in the book of Revelation. But I would argue that even that isn't exactly the way it is, or perhaps was not intended. The more I read Revelation, the more I find Revelation functioning in the same way as the ending of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. A reminder that in the midst of the apocalypse, and most of the early church saw that apocalypse as Jerusalem fell once again and the nation of Israel went out of existence. That apocalyptic sense was not only a day of judgment, but a day of hope. That in the midst of the judgment, God was present. Because not only is there that sense of final judgment, and I think that's heightened because we know we now have the capability of pulling it off as a human species, but also for those little apocalypses that we all deal with day in and day out. I don't know how many of those I had in junior and senior high, whether it was a day of getting beat up or a day of breaking up. I was sure the world was going to come to an end. It didn't, thanks be to God. And I moved on with the help of friends and my faith. But as I've grown up, I've witnessed so many more little apocalypses. Sometimes sounds so trite. Death of loved ones, divorces, sickness, catastrophic illness, accidents, loss of jobs, fires, all manner. Even the good changes in life can be apocalyptic, life-changing. Marriage, children, grandchildren. We don't have to look very far to see apocalyptic images in our news these days. A look at the Ukraine or Gaza. What more evidence of destruction and judgment? Ugly. How will we go through? The promise in the midst of the apocalypse is that note of hope. That even in the midst of all that we deal with, God is present and will bring us through. The problem, or the difficulty for most of us, is that in the midst of the apocalypse, we have trouble seeing God. And that is why we begin each church year with Advent and a return to the apocalypse. Because it's a reminder that there is that potential again, little or big, transitory or final. And that we should be prepared each day to deal with whatever life deals. And so the reminder is to avail oneself to the means of grace, the sacraments, the word, the body gathered. For it is there that we are honed in our ability to see God in those other places, and family and friends and strangers and all of those weird places where God shows up. Because in the midst of our apocalypses, it's hard to see. It's hard to keep that hope alive. And yet God is there, waiting into the midst of it, right there with us, that we might know that we are never alone, no matter how dire it seems at the moment. And so we enter this season in judgment and in hope, found wanting and hearing that word of grace and God's acceptance and promise of deliverance. But above all, that God is with us. Emmanuel. Amen.